Good day, Internet. This is Chavez and Valko, the key to your immigration solutions. With me, as always, is my favorite associate, Andrew Craven. How you doing today, Andrew?
Doing good, Ben. How are you?
I am doing surprisingly well. And as always, when you see our smiling faces, we're here to talk about everything employment-based immigration. Our firm collectively, we do all immigration, but Andrew and I, employment. And today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite hot topic, which is H-1B visas. What is going on with the current registration and cap season? We're going to try to break down the numbers for you a little bit and give you some context and then maybe some predictions as to what we think is going to happen. So, Andrew, for starters, how many H-1B registrations were there for fiscal year 2023?
There were 483,927, so just shy of 500,000.
Now, to be honest, I know there were some people that predicted 500,000. I was a little skeptical. I was thinking maybe 350 to 400, but wow, did they blow past expectations. So, to kind of put this in context, we wanted to bring up some numbers here about, what has been the H-1B sort of level over the last couple of years, right? So you can see that in 2012 and 2013 there was no lottery. Andrew, you are a new enough, a baby attorney to can you even wrap your mind around the fact that there was an H-1B season in which there was no lottery?
Absolutely not. I graduated law school 2019, so that was way before my time, but I'm kind of used to major lotteries and really trying to, initially before there was the registration process, just rush to make sure that you got your H-1B packet there day one so that you were considered for the lottery.
Yeah, so the way it used to work is everybody essentially filed their full H-1B petition, LCA, forms, support letter, filing fees on April 1st. And then, they basically continued to receive cases for that kind of first week. And at the end of the week, they're done, and we're going to conduct a lottery based on the cases that we received during that first week. And the way you would know the results is that if you got essentially a letter in the mail, you're like, aha, receipt notice. Our case was selected. And if you saw a packet in the mail, you're like, ah, crap, we didn't get selected because they sent back the whole packet, right? So you can just tell by looking at the mail what happened, right? Letter versus packet. So obviously 2020, 2012, 2013, I mean, this is as far back as I went on the numbers, but anyway, you can see over there's a rate 8.9, 8.1. That's actually the unemployment rate during that time period in question. So obviously, the reason that there was no lottery in 2012, 2013 is because we were still coming out of the recession. And I think in 2012, there was still H-1Bs available up until November, which just blows my mind, right? To think that in October, you could have filed a cap case and gotten selected. In 2013, I think it was June when they finally closed the cap. They kept receiving cases. And then 2014 on, right, we've been back to the everyone filed on April 1st. And you can see as the unemployment rate goes down, the number of H-1B or in this case, petitions went up, right? So 124, 172, 233, and it topped out at 236, right? And you can see the percentage increase there, right? So when you're coming out of the recession, 2013 to 2014 is when we see this huge percentage increase, 46%. It makes sense, right? We're coming out of a recession, unemployment's dropping, so H-1B registrations are going to go up. Oddly, in 2018, we see this drop, right? We see it start to go down in 2017 and then a huge drop in 2018, even though the unemployment rate was still going down. Andrew, what happened in 2017, 2018, 2019?
Well, there was a very particular administration in charge that really hammered H-1Bs. I know one of the biggest ones well, one of the biggest RFEs that was just regularly going out was challenging everything as a specialty occupation, especially if it was level one. So you had companies, I think there was a New York Times article talking about microbiologists and physicists and everything else being questioned like, do you really need a degree for that job? But I mean, the cost of H-1Bs really going up with all the RFEs and everything else drove down the number of people willing to go through the process.
Yeah, so we saw, obviously, we're talking about the Trump administration, and they were hyper aggressive towards H-1Bs, especially in like 2017, 2018. I think 2017 was the year of the level one wage RFE, um, which was bonkers. Now, of course, they ended up losing in court multiple times, and that went away. But that made 2017 this crazy year. Basically, they were challenging anybody that selected a level one wage as being like, well, yeah, we know that like accountants, like most of the time, need a degree, but if you're selecting a level one wage, those ones don't. Um, and so normally the H-1B petition, you can kind of see there's the correlation with unemployment. Unemployment goes up, H-1B petitions go down. Unemployment goes down, H-1B petitions go up. But 2017, 2018, 2019 was this weird period when unemployment went down, but H-1Bs went down because the administration was being so aggressive. I mean, the denial rate soared. And some of these Indian consultancies had denial rates of 40 to 50%. I even know of some employers that had damn near 100% denial rates. And so you saw a lot of those companies either just say, okay, we're not even going to do H-1Bs at all. We're just going to offshore the work, right? Because these were largely Indian consultancies, or we're going to transition to like the L-1B as an alternative to the H. And so you saw, when you're looking at like the big like Tata and Wipro and all these people, you saw their numbers just start to plummet in terms of applications. Of course, the level one thing got struck down. There was other challenges. A bunch of memos got challenged, and there was a settlement, the IT Serve Alliance settlement, that took away a bunch of these memos that they'd used to attack companies that were outsourcing, like the IT outsourcers. And so now, we kind of start to see petitions go back up, right? Sort of in relation to unemployment. And then, of course, there's 2021. And Andrew, what's important about 2021?
Well, 2021 would have been the first year that the registration process actually got started. So instead of going through the process we talked about before, where you send this entire packet with all the fees, your upwards of 3,000 ballpark of fees and everything else, you just spend the $10 early on, you register, and you see who gets selected before you go through the whole process of actually preparing the packet.
From the USCIS's standpoint, I mean, there is a legitimate argument to say, well, look, this makes things a lot easier for us because we don't have to receive and process 200,000 physical applications and then try to conduct a lottery, because someone's got to process all these cases, make sure they're complete, reject the ones that aren't complete, then enter that data and then run, right? It's they're saying, well, no, everyone just registers and we don't have to receive anything, no mailroom, right? We can just go into the system, bam, run the lottery. On that standpoint, saying, hey, this makes life easier for us, that's a true statement. And it lowered the barrier to entry for employers. You have a lot of employers like, oh, I got to hire an attorney. And even so, if my case gets selected, great. But if it doesn't get selected, I'm still out the legal fees, even if I get the filing fees back. So naturally, we saw it explode in 2021, right? All of a sudden, you see this huge increase. Whereas before, those increases were related to coming out of a recession, which made sense. But then suddenly we have this huge increase. And it's because of the registration system, because naturally people are like, oh, to get my name, to put my employee in I just got to pay $10. Sure, why not, right? And then we'll see how it goes. But then, of course, we see 2023 just fiscal year 20 just absolutely explode. And Andrew, what is obviously the suspicion as to why these numbers have just exploded?
Well, after the registration system got implemented, some people started to realize that you could do multiple registrations on the cheap, and increase your odds of selection. So instead of, my one employer that I've been working for in OPT, I'll have them register me one time. There were people advertising pretty blatantly, "Hey, come here and we'll enroll you in a bunch of registrations." One guy posted on Twitter that he had 12 registrations and 8 of them got selected. Just some very blatant, questionable acts of whether or not these are legitimate registrations or are people just trying to bump their odds up of getting selected.
Yeah, so people were like, "Wait a second, so can my employer register me more than once?" Well, no, if that happens, they will deny all of them, right? Which kind of sucks, right? Because we've seen that happen to clients that it was done accidentally and they deny all the registrations. It's like, well, can't you just deny the duplicate? And like, nope, all of them. Well, what if it's technically different employers that register me? Well, you can be registered 1,000 times if you had 1,000 different employers giving you a job offer. Of course, the thing we're seeing is that there's not 1,000 different actual job offers, right? It's one employer creating a series of shell companies essentially in order to register people 10, 20, 30, 40 times. And of course, we started to see in fiscal year 2022 a lot more of this. And I think people were testing the water to see, well, is USCIS going to pick up on this? Are they going to challenge it? Are we going to see higher denial rates? And that didn't happen. So that's why in fiscal year 2023, everyone's just like all in. Like, yeah, I mean, if you want to get selected, you got to be registered 15 times. Let's go. USCIS is not doing anything about it. Now, USCIS is set to publish a rule, I think, next month that's going to address several different things related to H-1Bs, including the registration system. So we have to see what's going to come out in that in terms of how they propose to, quote, fix it. But the the upside of the current system is, hey, low barrier to entry to employers, and for USCIS, it makes it just cheaper, easier, and more efficient. Of course, the downside is that it's just rife with fraud. I mean, the fraud is just insane. We're going to get into that in just a second. And then obviously off to the side here, we put the number of selections, meaning, hey, there were 274,000 registrations, but how many people did they select? They selected 106. Well, but there's only 85,000 H's available each year. Why did they select 106? Well, because fiscal year 2021, all this was done in March and April of 2020, right? So I think USCIS looked at it and said, oh, pandemic, a lot of these people that registered aren't going to end up applying, so we're going to over select. And then in fiscal year 2022, even though the registrations went up, their number of selections went down. Why? I don't know. I think it was a stupid mistake, but it seems like they only accounted for the denial rate, which is 3%. So they selected 85,000 plus 3%, so 87,500. Then, of course, this year, I think they finally kind of admitted that fraud is a huge issue and they need to select a ton of people to get to 85,000. So they selected 127 this year. Now, that begs the question of, well, does that mean in the first round? Actually, Andrew, because of all the fraud, how many lotteries did they end up doing last year?
Last year, it was 3. I think we started contemplating whether or not they were going to do a fourth, and we still question whether or not after the third lottery, if they actually met the 86,000 that they were supposed to.
I don't think they did. I don't think they got 85,000. I think the problem was that it was essentially March, and they realized they had to do another lottery, and that their system couldn't handle two, so they just closed it down. I don't think they actually got the 85,000. But if the H-1B is such a highly sought after visa, if they selected 87,000 people, why aren't they getting 87,000 applications?
It's probably a combination of things. You do have the ones that get rejected for improper filing. You have ones that just straight up get denied. You have people that don't file because they change their mind. And I think the biggest one, and what we're really getting at here, is there's probably a lot where it's like, hey, I got selected in 8 different registrations. I really just wanted to go work for Bob over here. So I'm going to have him file his petition, and then those other 7 are just going to lapse, not get filled. And you have enough people do that, then you might, you're going to get a certain percentage of return that's not the full 87,500.
Let's jump into that. We have another chart here to kind of see a breakdown of what happened last year. Now, again, some of these numbers are speculative. They have not released them yet. We're hoping that when they release the text of that proposed rule, that's where you usually see they actually show you numbers because they have to justify the rule. Like the last time we saw that was when the Trump administration put forth that rule to change from a lottery system to a wage preference system. Of course, that got challenged and didn't go through, but at least looking at the rule, it gave us tons of useful data. So anyway, some of this is speculation, but I'm looking at the numbers, right? We know they got 308,000 registrations. Well, how many of those were legitimate, right? Well, I'm just looking at historical numbers, right? If you remember, the previous high was about 233,000, I think, petitions, right?
236, yeah.
Yeah, so we're looking at so we're saying, well, I'm willing to bet that the high, and again, we know those are legitimate, right? Because that was back when they were having to file the full petition and people having to pay all the fees and stuff. So we're saying, okay, so if the legitimate registrations were about 234,000 out of 308, that means there was about 74,000 fraudulent or duplicate registrations, meaning your duplicate rate was about 24% of all cases were just duplicate registrations, right? They selected 87,500 and they got a response rate of about 66% or 57,500. So obviously that's why they had to do a round two, right? Because if you get 57,000 actual petitions, you're still 30,000 short. So they had to do a round two and a round three. Of course, the interesting thing is that with each round, the response rate goes down, right? So the response rate for like round two, I think was like 20%. Or maybe it was like high 20, and then round three was like low 20 or like high teens. Because naturally you have all these people that got selected, got approved, but they had other registrations out there. So if they get selected in subsequent rounds, they're not submitting anything at all. So looking at fiscal year 2022, this is kind of how we think it played out. Again, some of these, like the percentage of cases that were fraudulent, that is speculative based on previous years in terms of numbers of petitions, and then looking at what the response rate, that 66% number, at what the response rate was. So again, this is speculative, but I think it gives us a rough idea of what happened. Now, here's the key is we can look at this information and use it and apply it to fiscal year 2023 to try to figure out, well, what's going to happen, right? Because a lot of people are freaked out that it's like, oh, there's not going to be a second or a third round because they selected so many people. They selected 127,000. I mean, what's that an increase of 40,000 selections?
Well, yeah, about.
And by the way, if you add this up, if you look at this at the rate, it's 66%. If you add in 24 as being fraudulent, it gets you to 90. So there's an additional 10% there that I kind of left as a buffer, right? Because we have a 3% denial rate. We do have people that have legitimate multiple registrations. That does happen. And then the people that just backed out are like, nah, this employee left. We're not going to file for it. So there's that like 10% kind of buffer. Anyway, taking these numbers, let's look at FY 2023, fiscal year 2023. So let's look at our third chart here. 483,000. We're going to speculate that about 250,000 were legitimate. Obviously, we were thinking that number would naturally go up because, again, going back to the barrier of entry so low, that our previous high was 236, but that's when you had a high barrier to entry. Now that we have a low barrier to entry, we think our high would go up because, hey, it's only $10, right? Why not? Why not take the shot, right? But we're looking at the probable percentage of fraudulent cases doubled, right? Why did we go from 300 to almost 500? It's not because, Facebook decided to hire a whole bunch more people, right? I mean, their growth rate is at a certain percentage per year. So if they selected 127,000, that means their response rate is going to go down, right? Because if a higher percentage of your cases are fraudulent, your response rate is going to go down. So your response rate for round one, I put here speculatively, could drop from 66 to 42%. So if you have a 42% response rate, you're going to receive 53,000 cases, which means you're going to be short 31, which means there's going to be a round two. Andrew, any comments on these numbers?
I mean, like you said, we're guessing, but it's an educated guess. And yeah, I do just see at least one more lottery happening. We'll see if there's two or three again.
I wouldn't be surprised that there's three, right? Because if you're getting 42% response rate on your first round, that means the response rate on your second round is going to be like 10%. Probably. Again, some of you out there watching this, right? Your background is data and statistics and all that. I'd love to hear some feedback and comments or whatever about these numbers, right? But again, just based off of FY 2022, right, and just some general speculation, I think there's going to be around two, right? Because again, even though they selected more people, the response rate is going to be lower, way lower. Meaning, and again, if you need 31,000, you're not going to select 31,000 in a second round, right? Because you have to account for the low response rate, meaning the second round selection could be like 50,000, which means, in normal years, they selected, like, what did they select last year? I think they selected, it was something like 130,000 total selections between 3 rounds to get to 85, which, well, they say they got to 85. I don't believe them. You could see this year where they have to do 200,000 selections just to get to 85,000, which is bonkers and just shows that this system is broken, right? It doesn't work, right? It's too rife with fraud. Again, from the USCIS standpoint, is like, well, this makes our life easier. Yeah, but you're screwing over all of these people who went to school here, working on OPT, have legitimate job offers, and are just getting, their life, they're basically having to pack up and go home because of all of these people that are engaged in widespread fraud that you don't feel the need to address, other than adding one little disclaimer at the front of registration. By checking this box, I confirm that I have not engaged in fraud, right? And it's like, yeah, cool. Putting a disclaimer on something's going to really stop fraud. So this is our review of the numbers and what we think is going to happen, right? We think there's going to be around 2 and probably around 3, right? Because just the percentage of fraudulent cases is so high, the return rates are going to be very low. A couple other things we want to discuss. First off, Andrew, we'd been bantering back, before the video about, do we think we're going to see any Rfe trends because of this, right? So Andrew, what was one of the Rfe trends we discussed that we may see here?
Potentially looking at whether or not there actually is enough qualifying business. Because you were talking about, like, you can't just bench these folks after you hire them. So you can't sit here and be a company that's just, taking payments under the table to file registrations to assist with this if you don't actually need the person, have a position for them, or the work. So you can see USCIS starting to inquire about, following up on whether or not this person actually has real work to perform that meets the H-1B criteria.
Yeah, that used to be an RFE that we saw a lot, and they kind of backed off of. I mean, I personally really haven't seen any in the last couple of years where they used to question, we want proof that you have specialty occupation work available for this person for the entire period requested. I mean, usually when we saw those, it was like for startups, right? That, when you're entering in the net and gross income, you're putting in zeros, or you're writing a new company or something, and then they want to see, right? And then you'd be like, oh, well, here we have some contracts for work. Here we have, several $1 million in fundings. This is our runway, and you'd show it all. I could see a lot more of those, right? Because think about it. If I have this guy who set up a series of shell companies, let's say he sets up 20 companies, submits 20 registrations. I don't think there's 20 companies that have income, 20 companies that have tax returns, right? So you can see USCIS challenging that, right? And saying, we want to see evidence that you have specialty occupation work available for this person, and that you're not going to be benching them, because benching is, prohibited. It's written into the law, and that could give them the justification for that type of RFE sort of line. So I think you're going to see a lot more challenges as to whether or not it's legitimate, which is going to be hard. You know, you got selected, but it's going to be hard to kind of prove that. Especially when I think a lot of these people are, well, this leads into our second RFE trend that we may see. And what would that be, Andrew?
Looking at change of employer petitions, because essentially if you have this person that doesn't actually need the person, just helping file the registration, get the H-1B approved, and then you're passing them off to a company that actually wants them. So say you go through this whole process, you get your H-1B approved, and then October 2nd there's a change of employer filed. I could see USCIS really looking at, all right, did that first person actually need them? Was their petition legitimate? And if you have the beneficiary knowingly involved in this stuff, they could definitely get investigated, permanently flagged, and just
Yeah.
generally seeing the RFE looking at prove that you've been actually maintaining the status and that your original petition was valid.
Yeah, because you could see a scenario, two different scenarios, right? Scenario one is, hey, you know, I'm an IT outsourcing company. So obviously there's an end client, and I'm going to register this guy 20 times. And then once I get selected, I'm just going to take that end client contract and change the name, right, to whatever entity he got selected. And so, like, I do kind of intend to employ him. But the other scenario I think we're going to see a lot of is people, it's like, hey, I got my OPT. I work with company A. It's totally legit. And company A submitted a registration on my behalf, right? Totally legit. But I know my odds of getting selected are super duper low with one registration. So I went over here to my friend that I saw on Twitter, you know, hey, I could pay him $100 per registration. And he registered me 30 times, right? Well, if it's one of those that gets selected, right, they file a petition there, try to get it approved, but then immediately file a change of employer, right, so that he actually can come back to employer A. So he works for the dude over here for a day, right, and then 10-2. But I could see that you're going to get challenged, I think, on those. You're going to see requests for evidence that are like, well, prove to us that your original H was legitimate and that you had a legitimate job offer, that you had legitimately intended to work for them, and that they had work available. I just see them challenging that, and that being a problem. So I don't think necessarily these people are going to get away scot-free this year. We've also seen, you know, I think this is going to be the year where we start to see some, like, I just saw the other day that they charged 2 people with H-1B fraud because they filed a bunch of fraudulent H-1Bs because they're eventually benching people, right? Getting them approved, but then not actually paying them, just benching them until they had the work available. And then when they had the work available, like, haha, well, benching's illegal, right? And I just saw a lawsuit about that. So I'm thinking this is going to be the year where we actually see the Department of Justice or DHS come out with, oh, hey, by the way, you know, we investigated these people and a bunch of people got in trouble for this H-1B registration fraud. Of course, at the end of the day, it's going to be like 0.001%, you know, got caught. 99% are going to get away with it. The other big thing too is we're going to have to sit here and wait and see that rule and see what it's going to say and see how it's going to change things. Andrew, I want to talk a little bit here, just kind of to end, about what could USCIS do, at least in my mind, to solve stuff, right? Because when you had to file the full petition, right, that cut out all the fraud, right? Because I can't be fraudulent if I got to file a $460 filing fee, I got to file a $750 or $1,500 acquia fee, a $500 anti-fraud fee, potentially a premium processing fee, and I got to pay an attorney. That's like $10,000, right? So when it's $10, I can do 30 registrations, right? But I can't do 30 fraudulent cases when I got to fork out all that money, right? And so, but then USCIS is saying, yeah, but the old system of receiving the physical file, like, it, you know, then having to have a mail room and process it, and like, oh, like we just can't go back. So if you guys remember, there was a class action lawsuit. They ended up losing, But those are some of the arguments that the USCIS made. Andrew, off the top of your head, is there maybe a way to kind of take those two and combine them and make it actually kind of work?
I mean, my whole thing is just this is why we can't have nice things. Because it was good that we lowered the barrier to entry. It was good that we made this more efficient. And USCIS is so backlogged that it is good that we can make things more streamlined. So I wouldn't want to see any changes that just make it excessively complicated, which is what unfortunately these bad actors are pushing USCIS towards. So what I'm thinking is just enough information that a electronic system can validate, right? Because right now we're talking, you have to include the company's FEIN. So you have to have a legitimate company with an FEIN to get started on the registration. I would want any additional checks to be that sort of thing so that you can keep the price low, have a system sit here, run the check, make sure that it's still legit. Because if you have it where, okay, well, let's have an officer sit here and look at pictures of the building that they have or look at their contracts. Well, now you're using up an employee's time. You have to increase the cost of this. You increase the processing time. Because right now, the registration, I mean, they're giving us feedback in like a week, maybe less. It just has to be something efficient and cheap in my mind, that still would reduce bad actors and create some kind of penalty. Because even when we're talking about future RFEs, that that's going to create a burden on legitimate companies going through a legitimate process that are now going to have to respond to the RFE, hire an attorney. The attorney is going to have to take their time. Someone at USCIS is going to have to look through it, which costs them money. So it's really finding a way to dissuade bad actors while not continuing to mess up the immigration system for everyone doing it the right way.
There's two, in my mind, maybe two potential avenues to look at. One is obviously some type of company registration, right? You have to get sort of like pre-approved in order to submit an H registration. But again, you'd have to like implement a whole, administrative, process and dedicate resources and people to doing that. Like, I don't know, like, oh, so we register in March, so maybe I don't know, in October or something. Right. And again, the idea being that if you went through this registration process, you'd only do it once. So if you're Facebook, you register once and then you're good for all time and eternity, right? Like in the next years, you don't have to worry about it. And we see something like that with investor visas, right? So some countries like Canada, in England, in France, Japan, they register e-visa companies, right? So when I go and apply for my investor visa, the first person that goes has to go with this full giant application that justifies that there's been a substantial investment, that it's real and operating, that it's not marginal. And then it gets approved. And then the company gets a registration number. And then all subsequent employees that go and apply for an e visa for that same company, they don't need to submit any of the company docs. They just show up with like, hey, here's my form and here's my personal docs, my resume, my degree, maybe the org chart to see where I fit in. And that's it. And then some countries like Canada and England do require companies to sort of re-register every so often. Japan kind of takes the position of, hey, as long as you send someone like every year, you never really have to re-register. You just whenever you get your new tax return, update all your info, send that along with that next guy in April or whenever, and good to go. So, I mean, we do have like a precedent for like a type of company registration through, like, again, through the investor and the trade visas, where you do have that first time application that's kind of a pain, but then for everyone else behind them, right? We also have the same thing with the blanket L's, right? A blanket L, like a normal L, can be 1,500 pages, right? And I got to do that for every employee, and it's a pain in the butt. But if I get a blanket L, right, then suddenly they're able to like skip USCIS, go straight to the consulate with a tiny packet and apply for the visa. So there is some precedent there to that, but they'd have to be willing to dedicate the resources and have a process in place. And again, it's like, when are you applying and how quickly can they do it? Because you don't want to like apply in October. Now it's March, registration's open, but you're not approved or allowed to register yet. A second scenario is to go back to the old system, but of course, digitize it. It is freaking 2022. How in the hell is USCIS not online yet? I don't know if you people know this, but it's like when you do like an application for residency, you have to print out your application, paper application, fill it out, put all your documentation, mail it to USCIS, right? Goes to the service center. The officer there has to like manually enter stuff, goes through the file. When it gets set up for an interview, the officer has to send the physical file to the field office, and then you show up for your interview. And when you walk in, there's that physical file that you mailed a year ago is sitting on that officer's desk, and you're like, oh my gosh, we're supposed to be the greatest nation on the earth that invented the internet. We gave the world Google and Apple and Facebook and Amazon. Yet USCIS complains about, well, we can't go back to the old system because of the mailroom. Get rid of the mailroom, right? Just make it so that on April 1st, everyone can submit their H-1B application, but they just do it online. I log into my account. I submit my I-129, right? I submit my supporting docs. It goes, upload your passport, click, upload your visa, click, upload your, I-20s and other status documents, click, upload your educational documents, click, upload your employer support letter. Like they could have it so it's broken down, so it's easy on their end because, they're asking for specific things and you're able just to go pop, 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 LCA, pay the fees, right? Obviously, that puts a burden on the employer because you do have to like pay the fee and probably pay legal fees. It goes back to that same burden that employers had before, but it cuts out the fraud, right? So it does raise that barrier of entry because you have to be able to front all that money. Even if you don't get selected, you'll get the money, the filing fees back. But then so it does raise the bar to cut out the fraud. But then from USCIS's standpoint, if it's all done digitally, they should be able to conduct a lottery, right? No mailroom, no sorting, no manually entering stuff, right? They should be able to conduct a lottery. So it's like, okay, either go back to the old way, but make it 100% digital, right? Or figure out some other method. Anyway, we still don't know what it is that they're going to propose. Again, we just know the summary of the rule, which just says improve the H-1B registration process. So I don't know. To date, the only improvement we've gotten is a disclaimer, which if you're already engaged in fraud, I don't think you care about a disclaimer checkbox. But like you said, I mean, they're having to balance the right two considerations, right? The first being what's the impact on USCIS and do they have the funds, to do something? And then obviously, what is the impact on employers, right? Because, we want to cut out the fraud, but we don't want the barrier to entry to be too high. And there's this balancing test, and we're going to have to see. So, Andrew, any final comments on our favorite topic, which is the H-1B mess of the registration system?
Not that I remember. There was something that I wanted to make a point about, but just in general, the fact that USCIS does actually have some stuff online, but it's very random and not very well. And in general, they just need to update their whole system. Because I worked with someone on an I-539 that's online, which they won't allow you to actually technically have an attorney file for you. So I had to, basically be over their shoulder while they were working on that. But even the registration, we have the actual registration in the G28, which if y'all are involved in the immigration system, that G28 is just the power of attorney. So anytime you're working with an attorney, you got to do that. So you have to fill out the company's name when you set up the account, when you do the G28, and when you do the registration. And there's just so many places where you're duplicating the same information. It's just copy paste your attorney name, copy paste company name. And there's so much of this that they really should just, maybe Congress is going to have to pass some kind of budgeting bill, but it needs to be streamlined. They need a better online system.
I mean, there's so many rants, right? To be like, oh, wait, I-765s, super simple things, right? They used to do in 90 days, and they're actually required to do them in 90 days. Trump administration came in, effed it all up. They were taking 14 months for a simple work authorization, right? And then USCIS gets sued, and then of course they have to settle to, like, for example, offer automatic extensions to more people, or make it so that more people don't even have to apply. They get an incident to status. They're like, oh yeah, we're working on it. You're like, cool. Oh yeah, by the way, you can file it online now. We're like, oh right, awesome. That should speed things up. Oh yeah, but it's only for I-765s related to OPT. You're like, oh, cool. So what about all the adjustments of status? What about asylum? What about all these other people, right? And of course, the other thing too is at the end of the day, you're filing this super simple form online, and for whatever reason, they think that this is the most important thing in the world, meaning it has to be like physically reviewed by an officer. And it's like, why? Why does every I-90 or I-765 actually need an officer to look at, right? You can just upload the form, have your list of documents you want them to submit, right? Not just a list, like literally, like it's like submit your passport, submit your visa, right? And hypothetically, you could have a lot of these get approved without someone actually having to physically eyeball it on certain forms, right? I mean, if you do like an H-1B, an officer's going to review it, right? But like on an I-765, like an I-90, and like you said, some of these ones you can't even link to an attorney, so you can't actually file it through like an I-539. You can't file through an attorney. It's just absolutely ridiculous that we're at this state. And again, people talk about, well, hey, the unemployment rate's really low, and we can't find people to work. Well, and what's to give here? Like, why is the unemployment low, but businesses are desperate to find people? What a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of it has to do with immigration. It has to do with people who were working, filed their I-765 renewal, and it's taken 14 months, meaning they had to quit work. There's at least about 1 million people that have been sidelined because of USCIS processing delays on I-765s. Right. And then you start talking about, hey, they stopped doing consular processing of green cards for several years. So you're talking about probably several million people that would have come into the US and started working that didn't. So like, no, hey, let's just throw out a number, random number, 800,000 people a year coming in. Well, guess what? For the last 2 years, none of them have come in. That's 1.6 million people that have not come in that are not in the workforce, right? Plus the ones that are waiting on their pending EAD. Like, a lot of people don't realize that we're talking about 2 million people not in the workforce because of immigration stuff. And then it starts to make a little bit more sense of, wait, why is the unemployment rate now so low, but people can't find employees? A lot of it comes back to immigration. And again, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. A lot of it has to do with, right, Congress needs to probably appropriate more funds, right? I'm sure they're looking at this and saying, we're doing the best we can with what we have. Because there's also an article.
No offense to any USCIS officers out there. I'm sure they all want better equipment, better systems too.
I'm sure they hate the fact that like some dude shows up from hey, we got your mail from the service center, this gigantic stack of cases that are for interviews that are like physical files. I'm sure the USCIS officers are like, seriously, why can't I just like log into the computer and see the cases that I need to like to do? This is ridiculous. But we also know that USCIS, I can't remember how much it was, but it was something like they had like $1 billion to build a new system. I mean, I think this was mostly internal in terms of adjudicating cases and getting rid of paper, and it was a complete fiasco. Like, they spent $1 billion for nothing. Like, they ended up scrapping it basically because it turns out that the people that were hired to do it weren't consulting with USCIS officers to understand how they process cases and how they do work and how they would like the program to work. There's this like whole expose where like they went through the whole thing where I think it was in the neighborhood of like they spent $1 billion and then scrapped it. And that's one of the reasons they're still doing a lot of paper. It's like, oh my gosh, this is, but even if they do get the money, it's like they can still screw it up because it's government. But anyway, Andrew, as always, fun discussion about H-1Bs. I think the main takeaway here is I do believe that there will be a second lottery because of the high rate of duplicate cases. I also believe that we may be in store for some more aggressive RFEs. Again, we won't really know until we start to see feedback from other attorneys on terms of RFE trends. And then the last thing is, I know there's some people that are worried about, well, if they selected 127,000, what happens if they actually receive 85,000 petitions, right? Well, it's like in our history, in our experience, when they close something down, they announce that it's closed and stop receiving more petitions, but the ones they've received that they adjudicate, right? And of course, they won't know how many they're going to receive until the 90 days is up. So I don't really think there's a risk, honestly, of them my employer filed, but they filed regular processing and it's still pending, and or they can get to 85 and then I'm going to get screwed. I don't think it's going to happen. Personally, I can be wrong. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to stuck. First off, I don't think they're going to get to 85,000. Even if they did, they're stuck kind of adjudicating the cases they receive. Anyway, if you have any questions, comments, right, feel free to comment on any of our social medias. Hey, any of you guys that are really good with numbers, I'd love to hear your feedback, know what you think. There, I'm always open to it. This is why I'm an attorney, not an accountant. Numbers never really went my way. But hey, look, until then, stay tuned, right? As we do at least a weekly video with updates or discussing a specific visa or category. Also, make sure you download our app, the Lawpilot Guardian, on Android or iOS. The base app is free, tons of useful information and alerts. Otherwise, hey, any questions? You want to talk to us? Go to our website. You can schedule a consultation, and then we can look at your case and try to figure out, what options you have. But until then, Andrew, thank you as always. Joe in the background there helping out always. Thank you. And then we'll see you next week.